Welcome back to the Youth and Policy Podcast, the podcast where we discuss political ideology, policy, current day events, and more. I'm your host, Drew Hansen. Joining us today is AJ Dante, or otherwise known as Political Data on TikTok. How are you doing, AJ?
I'm doing pretty good. This is pretty fun, not gonna lie.
So if you guys aren't familiar with AJ, he is one of the few people that we see on, both political TikTok and overall in political discourse that describes himself as like a radical centrist. And another thing that has set him apart is his time on social media in general. So AJ, can you briefly explain what got you into politics and posting about it? Where did you start at, and what kind of led your beliefs? Did you ever change up, or have you always kind of stuck with the radical centrism?
Sure. I will say I've always been a fan of politics. I've always found it kind of drama-y and stuff like that. That's how I first got into it with the 2016 election. I know a bunch of other people did as well. I will say the word radical centrism I use sort of, tongue-in-cheek, but for those who don't know that's watching, radical centrism just means like you'll take a position on any spectrum ideologically, no matter what, like as long as it's backed up.
Right. And I think a lot of people misconstrue radical centrism with being a moderate and moderatism. Can you kind of explain the difference you have there?
Sure. So, for example, if you take an issue, the moderate approach or the middle ground fallacy, right? It's like you have two extremes. Why don't we just go in the middle, right? That doesn't make any sense. If it makes sense to go in one extreme, then why not go there, right? When I say radical centrism, there are some issues which I'm more middle ground on, like let's say abortion. But there's in some policies like I'm more on one side. Like, for example, on gay adoption, I'm more pro gay adoption. However, like on some social issues, I'm more socially conservative.
Right. And overall, something that is different from the common thing, the average person who's not to invest in politics will say they're, fiscally conservative and socially liberal. But you're quite the
Right.
opposite. You're actually left wing on economics and socially right. And the reasoning for this is everyone knows, if you don't know, AJ is very science first in his approach to things. So what about the stuff that you find within science leads you to those particular conclusions? Like what makes you distraught about the social left and about the economic right?
Well, I will say, even though I identify more economically left and socially right, more or less, even within those categories, I'm still in different places, right? So, for example, the reason why I lean more economically left is because I've seen the data on a lot of these programs, and a lot of programs for redistribution will help the average person. And since I am, pro America, super pro America, I want to help my country and specifically the people in the country. So if there's economic policies that can do that efficiently, then why not? Right? Like something I support is like basic incomes, especially in times of recession. I support things like certain redistributions, universal health care. I feel like this can help the average guy. However, on more socially right-leaning issues, I will say more culturally, in more of the cultural issues, I take more of a right-leaning stance. Socially, I'm actually right-leaning, I guess you could say, especially policy-wise. But like you were saying, I try to take an unbiased approach. Everyone's always biased, but
In the status quo, a lot of people describe themselves. The de facto answer is they are socially liberal and fiscally conservative.
Right.
You're actually quite the opposite, to where you are socially right and economically left in a sense. So what about science and the data you've seen draws you to those conclusions? And why do you think that is contrary to the status quo? Why do you think the status quo is the opposite?
Well, first, I don't want ideological bounds to get in the way of helping the citizens of my country. So, for example, take some left-wing economic approaches like socialized healthcare, universal basic income, or even just basic income in general, or supporting public transportation, or a lot of environmental approaches. A lot of these things are helping the average person, especially like if you were to implement this in the United States, it would benefit the average person. And so I don't want ideological grounds to get in the way of helping Americans. In the same sense, well, I will finish economic things with like, and the most important part is these things are actually backed empirically. So if you look at the data of more left-leaning economic policies, some of them, like rent control, does not seem to work at all, but other things do. So if it's empirically backed and going to help the American citizenry, it's like, of course, I'm going to support it. On the same side, on the right, it's like there's some social policies like helping, family, right? Family first. A lot of these policies that promote the well-being of the country, maintaining our interests, our cultural interests that are beneficial. I even think psychologically to Americans. And then I will say a lot of the right. When I say I'm socially the right, a lot of it comes from these new cultural movements, which I don't feel like they're aligned with a lot of the scientific literature, right? So, for example, I'll just give a brief example. The feminist movement, I'm super pro woman, I would call myself feminist in the definition of the word, of course. However, some of the new theorists, like Judith Butler or whoever it may be, and a lot of these new movements fail to take in uh, some basic sex differences into account, which we should probably be celebrating our human diversity rather than trying to cover it up. You know.
Right, and that's definitely an interesting approach to things, and specific to like the theory side. I did want to ask a question because since your approach to politics is definitely different from the average person's, where there was like a meme with on the teenage internet culture that was read theory for a really long time, just read theory. So I do want to talk about theory because some people that are big on theory and may not use as much stuff like science may critique science-based politics on the basis of like you post about this sometimes like academia's study replicability issue.
Mhm.
Claiming ethical prescriptions may be more important than the actual data, or even like the government and private industries control or influence over science. Like, for example, I saw someone in response to you one time say that they're very skeptical to science because of these influences, and they gave the example of like smoking. They're like, oh,
Mhm.
tobacco companies used to pay scientists to do faulty studies. So, what are
Right.
your responses to
Mhm.
those? And why do you
And
still think science comes first?
and they're completely right. It's like I do want to separate academia from science. Like science, as in, for example, if you look at the food industry, I think the majority of food studies are done by independent corporations, which that's kind of worrying, right? Like the food science industry and the medicinal industry, a lot of the psychological industry has a below average replicability rate, which is kind of concerning. Their statistical power is not super high in most of these studies, but uh, why we should maintain a science first approach is that, like I said previously, we want to be able to separate science and academia. Academia or science, the people who do science, they have always been politically motivated. There's no hiding that, right? There's no arbiter, right? When you're a kid, when you think of the scientists, these brave men in lab coats that fearlessly do perfect research, it's not
Right,
like
right.
that. So we do want to separate the good science from the bad science, and so any criticisms like that, I make myself. You were saying something at the beginning, right? Theory, in philosophy and stuff like that. I make a lot of jokes against philosophy and stuff like that. I do appreciate it. I take more of a pragmatic approach on philosophy, because I'll give you an example, right? Free will. Free will and human choice, these things are philosophically super important, super good for your just understanding how people work, super, super great. However, it does not seem like the concept of free will is actually a biological thing. It seems to not be that way. However, um, I mean, that's just one example of a stark divide, but like
Right,
obviously
right.
philosophy can be very pragmatic in its use. But what I'm fearful of is people who are, go down these rabbit holes and start just making theories and building theories on theories of, and most of political theory is just their interpretations on humans act and what to do about it. Well, you're not going to have a good what to do about it if you actually don't know how humans act, you know?
Mhm. Right, and, like, admittingly, I used to be, like, super skeptical to the science thing. It was a few months ago, but, what kinda annoyed me was when people would use, like, deductive reasoning. It's like, well, I could just deduct the same exact thing for something else, so let's just look at the data to prove it, and, the data shows that we're either right or wrong, and, like, I don't care if you can
Mhm.
logically deduct this if the deduction isn't empirically true. So
Right.
I definitely understand the sentiment there, and like especially touching on the problems within like science or academia or whatnot. I think everybody kind of knows that your special is in psychology and like the overall view of intelligence. So I guess if
Mhm.
you could kind of briefly explain what is intelligence for the average person, how have you come to understand it, specifically like general intelligence, because that's probably the most common and important aspect of
Right.
it. Why is
Mhm.
intelligence so important, and how did you come to realize that it was that way?
That's a good question. And briefly, I'll say this really fast. Another really important thing for people who are interested in science is the idea of like consilience or the concordance of evidence. There's a lot of scientific theory that is not like super empirically proven. However, even despite that, you still believe it because all lines of evidence point that way. So, for example, the Big Bang, we didn't, camera record the Big Bang. However, through multiple lines of evidence, we know that it's a thing. Same thing with human evolution. Get super ticked off when people like, especially in a fundamentalist sense, like try to deny it because there's so many lines of evidence pointing that way. We didn't record it with a camera, but actually
Yeah.
modern maybe. But general intelligence, this is really interesting, right? Because um, for those who don't know what it is, and I think you want me to explain it, general intelligence is the underlying factor of all cognitive abilities. We have taken cognitive ability tests, and this is not only historical but cross-cultural and even cross-species. Right? This is a real thing where all cognitive abilities correlate with each other. Right? And using some fancy science, if you take the test matrix and do a principal component analysis, you can get a general factor, which is called G, which is stands for general intelligence. And the importance of general intelligence is that we can measure it pretty well. It's called, and you know it as IQ testing, right? IQ testing is just the measurement of general intelligence. So, what's important about IQ? IQ correlates with virtually every life outcome. And in psychology, IQ best, is arguably the best psychological metric we have, period. And this has been stated by a lot of people, and you can empirically show this with like replicability, with um, usefulness. Because, like, for example, take any psychometric, there's three things you have to prove for it to be a good psychometric. It needs to be reliable. It can't just shooting arrows. It can't just go anywhere. It has to be consistent, right? It has to consistently get where it wants. And three, it has to have some use. And so, cool thing about IQ, all three of these down really well. Um, any way you'd like me to lead the discussion?
But I right, and, like, yeah, I noticed that with psychology when I was like, I DM'd you once. This is kinda transitioning into the next thing about psychology, but just, adding on to that last thing you said, when I was looking at like, social psychology, which sometimes,
Mhm.
had lower rates on there, and differential was very high, as well as some others. So, I mean, yeah, that's probably the exact I observed as well. And also
Mhm.
when, I was looking at I messaged, AJ about this. There was a program at my school to where they're talking about education and trying to improve cognitive ability in education, where they have things like, it's called, there's like things like brain gym, and the program we had was called Physics, to where they're like, oh, rhythm based things may improve scores, cognitive ability or whatever. And I was like, there's absolutely no way this works. And yeah, I ended up emailing the guy. It didn't have any kind of scientific backing. He like kind of sort of admitted it to me. But yeah, I messaged you about that, and you said, even the government hasn't found any long-term gains in this. So what I wanted to ask is, like, another thing you posted about was like learning styles and how it's a myth. My parents work in education, and they say the exact same thing about how there's this huge myth in this. So what
Right.
are these myths that you see about intelligence within the education system, and like how do we fix them? What are the policy approaches to fixing our education system to like actually get some sort of better outcomes for people?
Right. I will say the myths about intelligence, and this is gonna sound kind of like big,
Yeah, yeah.
but they don't just expand to education. Which, interestingly enough, teachers and educators believe in more myths about intelligence than the average layperson, which is really worrying, right? If you look at uh, there's this guy named Russell Warren. He does a lot of intelligence research. He writes a lot of textbooks for social sciences. Pretty smart guy. But he did analysis, I think, last year on the most popular introductory to psychology textbooks. And a lot of these introductory to psychology textbooks put a lot of these, mention like two or three uh, debunked myths on intelligence. And I'll list a few here. Um, One is that, in fact,
You're all good.
one is what I heard yesterday. Is that there's multiple intelligences, right? So, for example, uh, there's a lot of graphics which look really pretty, and I think they look really pretty, but don't have to be correct. It's like you have a logical brain, you have your linguistic brain, you have your kinetic brain, your musical
Emotional
brain,
intelligence.
emotional intelligence, all these different intelligences, right? And this is the theory that was created by, I think, Howard Gardner in the 80s or 90s, 80s. And and last decade he admitted, yeah, I'm sorry, this is this is not a thing. There's the modern evidence doesn't support this. However, a lot of educational approaches literally state his theory, which is interesting. Why would you put a theory that has been renounced by its creator? Um, and there's more like empirical ways to prove it too. It's like all these things correlate with each other. There's nothing independent or unique about these intelligences, right? Just like a human perception, maybe it's unique, but that's it. Um, Another thing is that intelligence, right? That it's like intelligence is so complicated, man. Like, how could we sum this down to a single number? Which, from the outside, is actually like something that makes sense when you hear it. Like, how could you dumb down the entire human intelligence to one number? Well, right, like I said previously, if measures of intelligence follow these three psychometric things, reliability, consistency, and utility, they're good metrics. And so we have actually empirically proven that your general intelligence, using a lot of big math things, which I won't explain here, but the IQ score is actually really good at dumbing this number down to a rank order style, I guess that some people would call it. Um, and I do want to make a side note. Intelligence or cognitive ability does not, for someone to logically jump from saying that IQ can be measured to some stance on morality is really stupid, right? Like, one
Yeah.
way to show this is if you have two kids and one kid is like 5 IQ points higher than the other, is the first kid like superior? No. Right? He could be a really bad person. So intelligence is just a metric. Um,
So what is your ideal like way we reshape our schools and getting rid of these? Are there any programs that could be put in place that show some sort of at least improving of test scores. I know cognitive ability increases are hard to come by, but
Yeah.
what's your ideal reform of this?
Well, how we can reform it is, I'll say one last myth is that intelligence is just something that people can shape, and I'm talking about like human behavioral traits in general, just something, people can shape like Play-Doh. Does not seem to be the case, right? And I hear a lot that, you know, and this is hereditarianism, right? Believing that traits are significantly influenced by genetics or biology, which, to prove my point well, it's like the majority of psychologists, the majority of the APA members believe that intelligence is majority influenced, at least in our country, by genetics, right? However, you hear people, and I can sympathize with this, but like you hear people saying, well, leading down this route obviously leads to a really bad,
Right.
leads to Germany, right? Uh, which ironically, Germany actually banned IQ tests, really, really against IQ testing, because guess who always won them?
Yeah.
But but this is not necessarily the case. In fact, blank slate approaches to behavioral traits have actually led to really bad things. Like Mao Zedong did a lot of social engineering because he believed that nothing was heritable.
Right. Right.
Um, some serial killers get put out of prison early because they believe the government was just able to put some spice in them, and they're now good people, which, or not good people, but like good for society, as in they won't commit any more crimes, which has led to more deaths. There's things like, do you know who Arthur Jensen is?
I've not heard. No.
He's a very controversial hereditarian, but he actually led to saving a bunch of lives with IQ testing in like the criminal justice system. Like they implemented IQ testing, showing those that are off the limits below, right? These people probably didn't were not cognitively functionable enough to make the most rational decisions, right?
Mhm.
So a lot of IQ can actually, in the cultural sense, give us a lot more compassion to those, on the lower ends of the intelligence spectrum.
Right, and
Um,
that's something that I did want to touch on, to where like whenever someone brings up IQ, a lot of
mhm.
people within all sides of politics automatically assume the worst, like we talked about earlier, to where
Right.
some people will use it. This is where your prescriptions kind of come into play to justify discrimination or whatever.
Mhm.
So, like, why is your approach better than that? Because I noticed you've always tried to distance yourself, particularly from that, and maybe even kind of gone at the people who try to use it to justify those things. Why is like compassion and you mentioned like reform and like obviously education and criminal justice
Mhm.
stuff. Why do you think that's obviously the much better approach to in terms of like not even just morality, but producing a better societal outcome?
Um, Maybe because I'm a compassionate person, maybe I just have common sense, but it's like once you have the facts about a situation, then you can start applying it to policy descriptions, right? There's very few like facts, like I'll say one that's like one of the very few. There's people who deny the idea of a binary sex system, right, in humans, which I think is pretty evident in all mammals that it's a binary sex system, right? So, like for example, there's some things in which some of the facts come out, and it's really hard to apply it for some reason or another. But something like intelligence, this is not necessarily the case, because once you get information on IQ or whatever, then you can start applying it to different positions, right? Like for example, do you know Steven Pinker? He wrote a book called The Blank Slate, and he wrote in there something pretty insightful, is that a lot of people conflate these things with like the worst side of politics, but Steven Pinker writes that there's a very large niche for the hereditarian left, because there's a lot of policies that can be supported by this research. I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of this. Let's look at immigration, right? Because on one side, someone what might say, um, if a lot of these IQ scores correlate with better social standings, national data, whatever, then you might want to get a lot of people to have above average IQ scores to come into your country because that leads to good social outcomes, and there's less stigma. Like, for example, if there are people coming with low IQ scores, then the average American might look at them and start developing stereotypes,
Right.
right? However, on the opposite side, one could say that because a lot of these IQ scores are developing faster in these non-Western nations, like um, having more lenient policies would bring especially hardworking immigrants into your country. Especially the fact that, do you know what brain drain is?
I don't.
So it's a phenomenon where if you take the best and brightest of a foreign country, that foreign country loses its best and brightest, which
Right.
actually hurts other countries. And so using IQ research, you can support the idea of saying, okay, maybe we shouldn't involve IQ in this discussion, because if we suck the best and brightest out of, let's say, Nigeria, that sucks for Nigeria.
Right, right,
You
and then it
know?
hurts our trade with them, and it has a negative impact on us too.
Right. So it's like different IQ data can lead us to any number of conclusions. It just depends on your policy standpoint.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly, and I think that's really important in terms of this discussion because, a lot of the time when people may interact with your page or, pages that provide things like that, automatically assume the worst, and then they trap themselves in sort of an echo chamber when dealing with this, and it's good
Right.
to hear, like, admittingly for some things, IQ would be useful, like education, criminal justice, but,
Mhm.
immigration might not be the best position. So, I mean, I've got most of my questions covered, but if
Mhm.
you have anything in particular you want to talk about, like more misconceptions, more policy areas where IQ would be useful, or
Mhm.
things you've done or personal projects you might be working on related to this, feel free to go ahead and start explaining. Most of
Sure.
the time's yours.
Mhm. I will say, like, another example, like policy. How can we combine IQ and policy to point in a direction I think would be good? It's like having in the education system, penalizing some teachers for not have because this is actually really tough, right? Because if you have a classroom, you obviously want the kids to reach their highest potential. However, if you go to some a ritzy city with really high performing kids, these teachers aren't going to have to do much to have good performing grades. But if you go to a more, rural or, like poor areas, you know, I feel bad for these teachers, because um, so there's a policy I thought used to be really good, right? You base the teacher's salary somewhat on the improvement of children's grades, which sounds really good, and actually I think could be useful in a lot of senses. But it starts getting complicated when you're saying, ah, it's like, is this actually plausible? Can we socially engineer these children? Um, right. So I will say a lot of educational things. I'm actually it's hard. The SATs is a big thing with secondary education. I think this can be really useful because a lot of people are against the SAT. You've probably seen a lot of movements to get rid of the SAT in
Yeah,
admissions,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
However, something bad that comes from this is, for example, take any college, right? Uh, Joe Schmo University, and they're looking for candidates. Well, one cool thing about the SAT is that no matter how rich your parents are, no matter how well you know the school, your SAT score isn't influenced by that. Your SAT score is influenced by how well you studied or
Right.
how well you know the information, right? However, virtually every other metric of the application process in the university, like community service, especially in your better place, or you have more free time because you don't have to support your family,
Mhm.
or other things like grades, which are super malleable depending on which school you're from, because how they do
Yeah,
grades is
exactly.
differently, right? A lot of these things can be subject to a lot of cultural, whatever, cultural noise. And
Mhm.
so SAT scores are one of the only things that are constant and not subject to bias, right? Because like if you're really ritzy, you can get that coach to write that letter saying, this kid is super cool. Put him in your school, and then like some Ivy Leagues do stupid like generation. What was the generational things where it's like
Like
legacy things, which I
Yeah.
think is really stupid. Um, so putting it on merit into the university is like really good. Um, Especially if you have people that maybe aren't best suited for these post-secondary education that relies on really complex thinking, like higher maths and stuff like that. Not everyone can be an engineer.
Mhm.
One policy I would support is not free college, but free trade schools. I would want free trade schools for any American that wants to do it, because this is a route any American can do, virtually any American. Because like free college, this isn't really going to do much, especially because we have a surplus of college degrees. People aren't using them. We need we need more trades, if anything. But yeah, that's just one example.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's perfect. I didn't really think about that in terms of the ace. I didn't ever really had an opinion either way.
mhm.
Centrist moment, but I never really thought of that in terms of yeah, that's definitely a really good take, and in terms of especially a lot of low income kids, I know personally too with like bad
Mhm.
grades, but get really good ACT, SAT scores. So I mean, if that's good
Well,
with you,
that's what it was used for, right? The IQ
yeah,
score, IQ was literally made. The first application of it was used to get low socioeconomic people to rise to a higher class because they were just stuck by generational poverty.
yeah, yeah, exactly, and
Mhm.
this is super informational in terms of
Yeah.
getting rid of a lot of the misconceptions and stuff. So, youth policy, thanks, AJ, or political
Mhm.
data on TikTok. Is that the name of your Instagram handle too?
Yeah.
For coming on. Yeah. And we will see him again soon. And this concludes the Youth and Policy podcast. Thank everybody for listening.
Peace out, y'all.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to continue to support us, you can do so by checking out our Instagram pages at Youth and Policy and at Watch Verbum. You can also look at our website at www.yipinstitute.com. Make sure to follow our page as we upload weekly. Have a great day.